Hi, this is Jason Adams, and you're listening to a special edition of Random Signal. The date is Friday, February 23rd, 2007, and yesterday I had the honor of attending two different lectures by science fiction author and technology activist Cory Doctorow. He spoke at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill in the afternoon, and then later that evening he spoke at Duke University. It is the Duke University lecture here that I bring to you in full, as it was the one that actually recorded at a listenable volume level. Unfortunately, I was sitting too far back at the UNC lecture, and the portable recorder I had picked up the woman behind me who was coughing more so than Cory actually speaking. But hopefully I will be able to isolate some of the better parts and bring those to you on a future regular episode of Random Signal. There's not going to be any music today because I'm just going to bring the whole lecture. It's just a tad over 59 minutes long, but it's really fascinating. It's on the subject of privacy, and in fact, the official title of the talk was From MySpace to Homeland Security, Privacy and the Totalitarian Urge, and it's really fascinating stuff. Cory is a brilliant guy. I have no idea how he has so much energy because from what I can tell, he's one of the busiest people on the planet. I really enjoyed hearing him talk, and I hope that you do too.
I like to start these things with a little benediction. Listen carefully. By accepting this material, e.g. listening, you agree on behalf of your employer to release me from all obligations and waivers arising from any and all non-negotiated agreements, licenses, terms of service, shrink wrap, click wrap, browse wrap, confidentiality, non-disclosure, non-compete, and acceptable use policies that I have entered into with your employer, its partners, licensors, agents, and assigns in perpetuity without prejudice to my ongoing rights and privileges. You further represent that you have the authority to release me from these agreements on behalf of your employer. Depending on how you see the world, depending on your natural slant and where you live in the world, technology informs your point of view. It can make you think, the net can make you think that technology will make us freer or that it will make it easier to control us. But if control wins, we're in deep trouble. One of my favorite writers is Mark Twain. And Mark Twain lived in a world where the technology of the day, the machine, the steam engine, lent itself to a point of view that we lived in a causal and therefore deterministic universe. And that if you went back far enough, you could find the universe laid out like a cosmic billiard table at the first moment of its creation, the first instant. And God was the man with the cue. And when he hit that ball, he set all of the universe in motion. And that everything that happened since was preordained. And if only you knew enough about the position of the cue ball and the English on the cue, you'd know everything that would happen. That the world was, in fact, deterministic. It seems ridiculous, but it's rooted in the same urge that gives us empiricism. And we are, of course, biologically inclined, I think, to believe in a deterministic and causal universe. After all, some distant ancestor of us worked out that you could reliably eat certain foodstuffs and wax, and other ones would kill you on the spot. Or that there were certain places where you could catch an antelope and certain ways of doing it that worked repeatably. And that repeatable, deterministic approach, that empiricism, led to many good things. Writing down stuff about how the world works and expecting it to happen again works. From the royal astronomers who discovered mechanisms for reliably navigating the entire world and its seas, to stuff that postdates the Enlightenment. Things as banal as your bankruptcy. If you find yourself in bankruptcy, the chances are that your trustee is going to make you keep a little book in your pocket in which you write down all the things that you spend, because the first step to gaining control of your life is knowing what you do with your life, is keeping track of how you live. If you go on a weight loss program, the first thing that your doctor or nutritionist will tell you to do is put a little notebook in your pocket and write down what you eat. You might find yourself with a pedometer on your hip that keeps track of how far you go, and you might in fact end up carrying a GPS that keeps track of where you go, and that might help you know more about yourself and others. People who are depressed or have other problems are finding making great strides with something called cognitive therapy, in which you keep track of the quantitative measure of your moods and what precipitates them and what other explanations there might be for them and what patterns you fall into. And indeed, we have at the beginning of the industrial age something called the time motion study, in which someone, mostly it was one of a couple of people, but the guy whose children wrote Cheaper by the Dozen, who were really responsible for this. And these people were slightly mad. They liked to not only write down everything that they did, but they liked to hold a stopwatch to it. They would, most famously, they would do things like button their shirts top down and bottom up to determine which one was fastest, and based on that, set policy for themselves such that they would evermore do things in the most efficient way. This gives rise to the modern workplace and the modern efficiency experts. And in some ways, it is the pinnacle of this idea of knowing yourself and improving yourself by relentlessly measuring what you do in the tradition of the Enlightenment and the tradition of science, and incrementally improving all those elements of your life that are within your control. But time motion study represents a kind of interstitial case, a case that sits on the edge. Because in time motion, it's not merely about measuring how you live your life so that you yourself can make better decisions and understand how to live your life better. It is likewise about enabling other people to measure how you live your life and to use that information to control how you live your life to maximize their benefit or their philosophy of how they might achieve some benefit, even when that means taking away some of your own personal autonomy, even when that means doing things in a way that upsets you or makes you unhappy or deprives you of some fulfillment or of some other critical element of your life. The internet makes it possible to collaborate and express yourself in ways that we've never before considered. We've historically thought of collaboration as something that was expensive and hard. The problem of the horse designed by the committee with 16 legs and heads at both ends. We've thought of collaboration as on large scales as being so transcendently hard that political ideologies grounded in it seem to be bankrupt a priori. The idea of a central committee, a planned economy, all seemed impossible to consider. And yet, we have, in the evolution of the net, like the first finny beasts crawling out of the sea and moving to animals walking upright, we have transitions like news groups to blogs to Flickr. News groups expressing, especially in the alt hierarchy, this is the hierarchy of discussions that anyone could create a new topic in. Believe it or not, there was a time on the internet where if you wanted to talk about something new, you needed permission. You needed to actually convince huge committees of people to vote for your idea for talking about something new, and vote about where in the one true hierarchy of all knowledge, the Usenet, it belonged. And an anarchist, a personal libertarian, a guy named John Gilmore, who had founded one of the first internet service providers that wasn't run by an institution that relied on government money, and therefore had to be very, very cautious about whether or not anyone ended up talking about sex on the nascent internet. He decided that he would invent a new kind of internet discussion forum, the alt hierarchy, that anyone could create a new one in. The alt hierarchy quickly grew to dwarf all the others, and it turned out that if you built it, people would come. You could start obscure news groups like alt.pavetheearth, in which people would actually write out schematic diagrams and plan in great and demented detail a grandiose plan for paving the earth and racing performance motorcycles across it. That it turned out that it was in fact possible to discover people who thought that this kind of thing was an interesting thing to do with your time without spending copious amounts of money putting classified ads in the world's newspapers. You know, you might think, you sometimes encounter learned societies with bizarre traditions, and you ask yourself, how is it that anyone ever found anyone else interested in engaging in that kind of secret handshake, that kind of ritual? Where did they find someone else who thought that lying in a coffin and forswearing your allegiance to some power and swearing your allegiance to another was in fact the kind of thing that might be a fun thing to do in your first evening on campus, as opposed to going out and getting drunk with everyone else. And yet somehow we've overcome those coordination costs historically. We've found people to join us in following our weird. And the internet's made it possible to do that in ways that we never before considered possible. And consider how blogs expanded that in ways that, we'd never considered possible. That suddenly we found ourselves with a world in which any topic, no matter how narrow and niche, could be discussed and could find as its basis find itself as the basis of not just say one site, but dozens of sites that might compete with one another to delve into the true nature of racing performance motorcycles across the newly paved earth. And then consider how the cost of collaboration fell even further with something like Flickr, the image sharing site, which introduces, not as the first site to do this, but one of the first sites to make this really work, the idea of tags. The idea that instead of having the one true hierarchy of all knowledge, that anyone can throw any label onto anything, and that you'll resolve the collisions. They'll just kind of work out in the wash. So if I tag my picture of Paris with Paris, and you tag your picture of Paris Hilton with Paris, and someone else tags a picture of Paris and Athena with Paris, that human beings will figure out how to disambiguate it, and the cost of that disambiguation is lower than the cost of all of us getting together and agreeing which version of Paris each of us will use as our tags. And so Flickr allows people to collaborate without even knowing each other, without ever having met each other, without even knowing that each other exists necessarily. For example, I watch a Flickr tag I quite like called Decay. And this is, as you might expect, pictures of things decaying, which lend themselves unexpectedly, I think, to photographic treatment, whether that's old barns falling down in kind of grandiose Gothic ruin, or the thing that someone left in the back of the fridge that's turned into a science experiment, or a leaf going to crumble and rot, or the mulch in your compost heap. I mean, all these things are rich in texture, the rust and so on. And this coffee table book, this perpetual, never-ending coffee table book that is hundreds of photos tagged with decay that show up every day on Flickr from people who've never met, who've never had a discussion, never had a committee meeting, never set out a set of formal requirements, have no organization, no mechanism for changing direction, for setting boundaries, that all of this stuff nevertheless occurs at almost no cost, right? So cheaply that these people don't even think of what they're doing necessarily as collaboration. And it gets cheaper than that, right? Flickr is actually comparatively expensive collaboration compared to what we do every time you or I or anyone else who writes the web makes a link between two web pages. When we make links between web pages, we elucidate a structure of the internet that Google can come along later and tease out. People are good at understanding things. Computers are good at fetishistically counting things. People are bad at counting things. Computers are bad at understanding things. You can meld computers and humans in a kind of cyborg if you get computers to do the things computers are good at and humans to do the things that humans are good at. So every time you and I make a link between any two web pages, Google comes along and counts that link. And they go, well, some human being, someone possessed of more intelligence than my computer will ever have, understands that there's something related between these web pages. And moreover, this web page has 5 times more links pointing to it than the next web page over. And so this is probably a lot more authoritative than that other page. And moreover, not only is this more authoritative, and not only should this page float higher in search results, but all the pages that this page links to, it confers some transient authority to, or transitive authority to. It adds its authority, its weight. This highly regarded web page holds this other web page in regard. And so you and I and everyone else who's ever made a link between two web pages has helped in some way collaborate to allow Google's robots, Google's machines, to understand the structure of the largest, most ambitious book the human race has ever written. And this is a stupendous act of collaboration, and it's so cheap that it's sometimes you have to think about it for 5 or 10 minutes to even understand that it is collaboration. And a lot of people would still resist the idea that they're collaborating when they do this. MySpace, YouTube, these are systems in which we are collaborating in ways that we've never dreamt of before. People are posting a video and someone else is coming along and mashing that video up with another video and adding it to the internet. And in each one of these instances, we're cheapening the cost of collaboration to make creative endeavors that would historically have been nearly impossible to consider. Free and open source software is an enormously cheap collaboration and communication system that defies historical reason about how we make stuff. The idea that you could erect an edifice as large and complicated as an operating system, the operating system that powers this computer in front of me, by using volunteer labor and paid labor, but paid labor for entities who don't know each other, who don't coordinate with one another, and who sometimes actively work to undermine each other and dislike each other as competitors in a marketplace, and then that could somehow yield the most popular operating system for the servers that run the internet. Not a hobbyist operating system that a few people indulge in, like people who might chrome the exhaust pipes of their car, but rather a fundamental piece of the plumbing of the internet is built in this way, suggests that we are engaged in a truly novel way of collaborating and expressing ourselves. It's almost impossible not to express yourself with the internet. It's almost impossible to it's almost impossible to prevent free expression on the internet. Dana Boyd, the social science researcher at the Annenberg Center in Los Angeles, has documented how kids who are frozen out of networks, social networks that try to lock younger children out in order to comply with regulation or to reduce their liability will simply reverse their age. So 13-year-olds become 31-year-olds, 14-year-olds become 41-year-olds, and so on. My editor at Information Week, Mitch Wagner, recently discovered 2 teenage girls talking about who in class was a skank on his message board for his blog for chief information officers. The reason that they were discussing it there is because all the other social networking sites had been blocked by their school administrator, which stopped these children for approximately an 11th of a second. The history of technology is filled with people who have taken extraordinary measures to express themselves, to control their personal information, to control the information around them, to know themselves better and to know the world better. Many of us remember that there was a time when computers were not things that sat on our desktops. What sat on our desktop was a dumb terminal, and it was used by people who were thought of as dumb people by their employer. There was instead a priesthood who would program the mainframe and determine a priori which screens you could and couldn't see on your dumb terminal, because they knew better than you how you should be calculating the information around you, how you should be recording the information around you. And early PC pioneers remember people writing letters, heartbreaking letters to PC companies saying, "I lost my job because I snuck one of your machines under my desk so that I could compute the world in a way that made more sense to me, so that I could make sense of the world in a way that defied the authority of the priesthood, the mainframe." And that's not new, right? Subsequently, we had entities and enterprises where they blocked peer-to-peer protocols, messaging protocols, email, and so on the grounds that they weren't controlled enough, that they weren't manageable enough, that company secrets could be leaking out through the email, and if you couldn't log every message that left the enterprise, you wouldn't be able to comply, you wouldn't be able to know what was going on, you'd have to wiretap every employee, and you'd have to block attachments that seemed suspicious, you'd have to stop people from looking at websites that looked wrong, and employees just went around them. They interpreted them as damage and went around them, and they installed peer-to-peer software, they installed Yahoo Instant Messaging, they used Hotmail to send email around because they couldn't send attachments, and this, in fact, built a fortune in the form of Ray Ozzy's company Groove, whose entire sales pitch was, "We do all of those things that your employees are doing despite you, but we give you a management interface." And that turned out to be enough to turn Ray Ozzy into a millionaire again when Microsoft bought his company for $50-some million. So the net informs this ideology. The net informs this ideology that says more control is less effectiveness. More control is less efficiency. Many of you are familiar with the net neutrality debate. This is the debate about whether or not the internet will be improved if the people who build it, the people who provision those incredibly expensive circuits and rights of way, are able to discriminate against traffic based on who's paid and who hasn't. We're familiar with Senator Stevens' theory of tubes and the idea that some internets are blocked when other internets hog them. But the people who actually know about this stuff, right? Not the mythical pointy-haired bosses who send their trained seals to the Hill to bark on their behalf, but the people who actually build these networks and manage these networks that have the ability to manage traffic and discriminate against traffic tell a different story. They say that it's actually cheaper to provide more service than it is to try and control access to the service that you have to make sure that it never gets too crowded. The chief spokesperson for Internet2, the academic network that spans this country and links universities in a very, very high-speed internet IPv6 network that has the capacity to control who gets to use it and in what order and to prioritize some packets over others, testified to the Senate that when we first began to deploy this network, our engineers started with the assumption that we could find technical ways of prioritizing certain kinds of bits, such as streaming video or video conferencing, in order to assure that they arrive without delay. For a number of years, we seriously explored these quality of service schemes, including having our engineers convene a quality of service working group. Surely anything that involves convening a working group is almost certainly doomed. As it developed, though all of the research and practical experience, supported the conclusion that it was far more cost-effective to simply provide more bandwidth. With enough bandwidth in the network, there is no congestion, and video bits do not need preferential treatment. All the bits arrive fast enough, even if intermingled. In other words, it's cheaper to just throw more capacity at contention problems than it is to figure out how to control the network, and than it is to figure out how to prioritize the network. The coordination costs of deciding who gets what when and making sure that you do that in the most optimal way exceed the capital costs of just sticking more fiber down the pipe whenever you start to feel a little congestion in the tubes. The web. Obviously, Tim Berners-Lee, a physicist at CERN, needed a better way to share data, and he was able to deploy the web at a time when all the data sharing that was going on through academic institutions and through corporations was being done inside of walled gardens that used these incredibly thought-through protocols and that were edging towards this kind of hypertextual utopia in which all the pieces would be tightly coupled, and anytime I made a link, it would immediately show you that I'd made the link, and you would see it on your site, and I would see it on my site, and we could take pieces from one another, and it'd be this very controlled, maximally agreed upon, highly coordinated effort. And instead, Tim Berners-Lee made the smallest piece of the web that he could. He made this like infinitesimal, almost insignificant thing, which was just an innocent way of marking up some text and adding links to it, and a lightweight server that would throw this text back and forth, and a lightweight client that would let you see what was happening in the servers. And he left off all the hard stuff, all the semantic web stuff and so on, because that required such giant monolithic agreement that it turned out to be something that even today, years later, we struggle with. And the web blossomed and eclipsed all the other hypertexts that anyone's ever thought of. And today you see the advocates of those hypertexts limping around the lecture circuit saying, but we had it right, damn it, and we could have done it if only they hadn't jumped the gun with this half-assed idea. We would have someday eventually come to the agreement that would have given us this. And so on, and of course the final example that you have to give whenever you're talking about the ideology that the net informs, this less control is better, less coordination is, it's always cheaper to add capacity than it is to add coordination, is Wikipedia, the encyclopedia that anyone can write. My student's assignment at USC is every week to find Wikipedia entries that relate to our course material and find ways of improving them. And what they find is that despite the fact that Wikipedia's social contract, which is actually becoming a little large and unwieldy these days, was arrived at kind of organically without any central planning, that nevertheless it just works, right? It was responsive instead of forward-looking. Each piece of Wikipedia's social policy responds to some problem that it confronted, rather than representing some a priori idea about how Wikipedia might need to function if you were going to erect an encyclopedia that anyone could edit. And Wikipedia is great. The people who say Wikipedia doesn't work for them are evidently reading a different Wikipedia from the one I rely on every single day. Because for all that occasionally you find an error in Wikipedia, I've yet to find an information resource as valuable as it ever before or ever since. But the internet doesn't just inform this ideology that less control is better and that we can coordinate ourselves with less control than ever before. It informs a seemingly contradictory ideology, the idea that the control-topia is just around the corner, that because we can fetishistically count things in a way that was never possible before, just as Twain's machines could fetishistically repeat tasks with precision and an invariance that no tradesman could have aspired to, that we will someday master our universe by knowing its every corner, and that when we do, we can compute where all those billiard balls are, which direction they're moving in, and solve all of our problems once and for all by just expanding and expanding the sphere of our control, by adding more and more computers, more and more databases to the world. So, for example, we have the US Visit program. As an immigrant and a visitor to your country, I'm privileged to be fingerprinted when I visit, as have innumerable other visitors to this country. Leaving aside the cost and goodwill, although we'll return to that US Visit has created around the world, we should look at the monetary cost of US Visit. $15 billion into US Visit, it has caught 1,000 bad guys. And those bad guys weren't terrorists. They were people who'd overstayed their visas, or who had applied for the wrong kind of visa, or who'd snuck into the country, or who'd lied about whether or not they had a misdemeanor pot offense in their home country, right? So at the cost of $15 million each, we have caught 1,000 welfare cheats by expanding the haystack into larger and larger orders of magnitude with the idea that eventually, if we just make it big enough, the needles will pop to the surface. Consider the idea of web blacklists, which it's a national embarrassment that many of our libraries are required as a condition of their funding to deploy these blacklists that try to separate the wheat from the chaff on the internet, try to determine what is and isn't a legitimate web page for people to be looking at. And the idea is that we can kind of get there just by throwing more people at it, right? Eventually there'll be enough boiler rooms filled with enough retrained, laid-off workers from industrial sectors that spend all day and all night looking at every web page, perfectly determining which ones are pornography or frivolous and which ones aren't, that someday the web will work. Right, and we'll be able to return to this control-topia in our workplaces, and that all we need to do is just filter everything that you look at and maintain a list of everything that you look at and maintain a list of everything that you might look at, and eventually we'll be able to track that intractable thing. And thus far it seems to be failing. Thus far it seems to lock legitimate people out of looking at legitimate things and have virtually no impact on people who are doing stuff that's genuinely creepy and wrong. For example, Canada is now considering something called cleanfeeds.ca, which will be a secret list of child pornography that you're not allowed to look at on the internet. The idea is that the secret list will be compiled by people who will send anonymous tips to a secret board that will make that secret list and deploy it to all of the big ISPs that will look at every query that you make, find the ones that are likely to be likely to result in you looking at child pornography and stop you from looking at it silently, send you a kind of generic 404 error message. But that abuse can be stopped because people who deduce that this 404 error message is actually from this secret list can then appeal it, and if they lose, of course, it turns out that they really are a child pornographer, that they were, and so, but nevertheless, that potential social stigma won't at all chill people from appealing the blacklist items that are erroneously there, that they somehow magically divine are there on the list and not just a website that they can't reach because the tubes are clogged, and that this will somehow prevent people from seeing child pornography. But everyone who you ask about this, who advocates the system, when you say, well, child pornographers surely will use simple tools to evade these network proxies, and they go, oh, yeah, well, you can't stop child pornographers. Those people are like, determined. No. What we're going to stop is we're going to stop people who accidentally see child porn while looking at other websites. I don't know about you guys. I surf like 6 or 7 sigmas outside average, and I've never accidentally seen child porn while looking at a website. Admittedly, sometimes in spam, and it's despicable and wrong, and I don't want to minimize the problem of child pornography. I just think that if it's a genuine problem, we should take genuine measures to reduce it, not feel-good voodoo nonsense that reduces our net freedom of expression and anonymity and so on. This is the approach that we're taking, and it's a failure, and it continues to be a failure. Some of the empirical research on this, my former employer, Electronic Frontier Foundation, collaborated on a project to take the top 100 Google results for the most important keywords in the common curriculum, the national curriculum, and compare those against the blacklists used by our national libraries, and determined that something like a third of the most important web pages related to the most important keywords related to our common curriculum were off limits to our students. So at the same time, there has yet to be born the young person who is determined to look at not child pornography, at pornography or other illegitimate material on the internet, who has been deterred from doing so by one of these filters. All it takes to evade the filter is to create one more bad page. All it takes to keep the filter perfect is the instant a bad page is created, to find it at that instant, properly classify it at that instant, and push that update out to every single client in the country. Not very practical. And so on and so forth. Data retention proposals, the Deleting Online Predators Act, both of which propose to surveil us, to subject us to incredible amounts of non-particularized search with and suspicion, despite the fact that none of us have necessarily done anything wrong, and then to subsequently go back and forensically examine the evidence and figure out what's happened. That proposed to keep kids off of the internet, something that anyone who is skilled with the internet and who watches kids knows is a dead objective, one that will only break your heart no matter how hard you try it. The no-fly lists that we compile that attempt to try to catalog all the potential bad guys in the world who are so bad that they shouldn't get in airplanes, but not so bad that we can arrest them. These have been, and will remain failures at achieving their nominal objective. And statistically, with things like no-fly lists and child predators and bad web pages, it's kind of easy to understand why. As soon as you try a little Gedanken experiment, this is one that I borrowed from my friend Bruce Schneier, who's a wonderful security expert and has many great and important things to say about privacy and individuality and security. And Schneier says, imagine that you had a terrorism detector that was 99% accurate. And you connected it to a rifle targeting system above the magnetometer at the airport. And every time it detected a terrorist, it shot him or her through the head. Right? Now, imagine that 1 in a million flyers is a terrorist. So of the million flyers who pass through that at a 99% accurate rate, 10,000 of them will be shot in the head. One of them will be a terrorist. Right? Whenever you use machines to compile enormous lists of stuff looking for the bad apple in the bunch, and where the test is far less accurate than the prevalence of the thing that you're looking for, you will have far more false positives than you will actual genuine positives. And you will end up punishing an almost limitless number of innocent people to get at a rare guilty person. The fact is that when you watch everyone, you watch no one. I met my girlfriend some years ago at an event in Finland at Midsummer's. And Finland in Midsummer's is glorious. The sun doesn't set. And we sat up all night on the roof of the Torney Hotel, where we were put up by the people who brought us in for this conference talking. And the sun never went down. And in the morning we went down and we noticed this plaque by the front door that we had never seen before. This hotel, during the Soviet occupation, by dint of being the tallest building in central Helsinki, was the KGB headquarters during the Soviet occupation. When this 12-story hotel was reclaimed from the KGB, 40 kilometers of wiretap wire was fished out of its walls, because the central business of the KGB was wiretapping the KGB. In a kind of ghastly Moore's law, or Metcalfe's law, every time you added a new KGB apparatchik, you needed to add another 10 kilometers of wire to link his office with everyone else's and everyone else's office with his, so that they could all spy on each other. A culture of suspicion is not a transparent society. A snitch nation does not turn up more bad guys. It merely makes us all more suspicious of each other and less capable of creating collective effort and erecting the fruits of those collective efforts, the Linuxes, the Flickr tags, the Google indexes. The Stasi had files on practically every citizen of East Berlin, every resident of East Berlin, and they were so busy trying to figure out who was telling naughty jokes that they missed the fact that the wall was about to come down. Because when you watch everyone, you watch no one. We have, since the birth of the automobile, we think of the automobile as a great empowerer of the teenager, and it's true. The sexual revolution owes a great deal to the teenager. To the car, rather, and it's in fact a teenager. Excuse me, I only got a few hours sleep last night. We think of that, but it also marks the beginning of the first time that American youths have routinely carried identification papers. And that marks the beginning of or rather the first really visible sign of a trend that has continued to this day, where our identity papers are not only being carried, but they're ubiquitous. And they are read without our permission, without our knowledge, and they are required in many instances to go anywhere or do anything. The number of places where you can be asked for your identification these days is stupendous, and none of those seem to make us any safer. They just seem to increase the size of the haystack. Now, the danger in a world in which everyone is being watched, in which we're all carrying identity papers and so on, isn't that will all be caught for minor infractions. Of course, no one's going to arrest everyone, right? They can't put us all in the gulag. They can't turn us all into no-flyers. They can't take everyone and suspend their network privileges for file sharing. They can sue 700 Americans a month for downloading music, but there's 70 million of them at it, right? They're going to run out of lawyer hours. There are not enough lawyer hours remaining between now and the heat death of the universe to sue all of those music fans. The problem isn't that when you are guilty of everything, that it automatically means that you'll serve a jail sentence, although we do have some of that emerging. In London, with a traffic camera on every corner to measure your license plate and make sure that you've paid your fee to drive in the center of town, those traffic cameras double as speed cameras. And if you edge over the speed limit by even a few miles an hour, you'll find a 100-pound ticket in your mailbox. So literally, the instant you put your foot down a little too much, you gun it to get up that hill, the ticket arrives in your mailbox. But that's not the real danger, although that robotic enforcement is pernicious. The real danger is that as soon as everyone is presumptively guilty of something, none of us have any rights at all. Everyone in the Gulag was there for black marketeering. Not for speaking their mind about the failings of communism, but because they were black marketeering. Of course they were black marketeering, because it was impossible to live without being a black marketeer in the former Soviet Union. When you see students being busted for writing search engines on campus that search the campus network and find all the files in everyone's publicly shared directories and index them in exactly the same way that Google finds all the files in all the publicly shared web directories of all the servers of the internet and makes them available, those students are targeted by the Recording Industry Association because they made that software. That's not what the Recording Association of America goes after them for. They go after them for file sharing, because all students file share. All students are presumptive copyright criminals, and you don't need to bust them for the things that they've done that you want them to stop doing, that we would all agree are legitimate. Instead, you bust them for the thing that we all do anyways, and that you know that you can get them for. And it's a much easier way of accomplishing your goals. And it's a much more pernicious threat to our individual liberty. We need to distinguish sharply between technologies that allow us to engage in personal and collective empiricism, to measure the world and understand how it works and improve ourselves, and those technologies that know what we do, when we do it, and who we think we are when we're doing it, and use that information against us. It's one thing to have your computer keep track of what websites you visited and autocomplete your locations when you type them into your location bar. That's a genuine service, and I would like to see a browser that gave me more control over it, and we're seeing the first inklings of it. The new version of Safari, Apple's browser, actually comes with a pornography mode where you can turn off history while you're looking at stuff you're not supposed to, and then turn it back on again. We're starting to see the first inklings of this stuff. But the idea that someone out there does that for us or to us is the difference between a computer that enables us and a computer that controls us. And it's the difference between enlightenment and totalitarianism. It's the difference between the promise of the internet and the peril of the internet. The ability of machines to sum us up and know us is greater than it's ever been before. The radio frequency ID tag is becoming a fixture in our wallets, in our cars, and in all the devices that we use. And there are many other radio beacons, the Bluetooth beacon in our phone, the Nike beacon in our shoes that is part of our wireless pedometer rig, and so on. All of these things can be used to uniquely identify us as we move through time and space, either before or after the fact. For example, the London Underground. I use a lot of British examples because that's where I live. The London Underground last New Year's before last, took away all of its weekly travel cards and even most of its daily travel cards, and doubled the price of the daily travel cards that remained, but offered you a discount, which is to say the price that you used to pay, if you would carry an Oyster card, which has a radio frequency ID tag in it. And the answer to the data retention questions, to the questions about privacy and about having your movements tracked as you move through time and space, was that because you could buy these things with cash, because they didn't keep a record of who bought what when, you would be fine, that you didn't have any privacy risk. But there are innumerable privacy risks that emerge after the fact. After the fact, when you're accused of doing something, your back trail can be run using your RFID tag, using your freeway toll pass. And those freeway toll passes, by the way, don't have an off switch and can be read even when you're not going through a toll booth. And the California Highway Patrol seeds toll readers up and down the freeway to keep track of who's going where and when, presumably to improve our traffic flows. And I can support that as an objective, but at the same time, when we live in an era in which warrantless wiretapping is the order of the day, in which our national security apparatus has become a kind of mad toddler smashing everything that it can reach, leaving poison on the bottom shelf is not responsible behavior. As soon as you start collecting information that can be used against huge numbers of citizens and leaving it where it can be reached by a subpoena or even without a subpoena, you endanger those people recklessly. And you have no business doing it in this world that we live in. Excuse me, I've just lost my place a little here. The other thing about radio frequency ID tags is that their read distance is not limited to the few inches that they operate at. In fact, the read distance is much longer than that. And this is something that's not widely understood, although people who attend hacker conferences like Black Hat in Las Vegas every year will participate sometimes in competitions to see who can read these things from the longest distance. I think the record last summer was set at something like 60 feet. As a technical matter, it's kind of interesting to understand how this works. Many radio frequency ID tags power themselves by receiving a short burst of radio energy, and that actually lights up the circuit. It can harvest enough electrical energy from that radio burst to power itself up and burst back a little unique identifier. And that unique identifier is then read by a reader that's very close by. And the theory goes that because exciting these radio frequency ID tags requires a fair bit of radio energy, and because radio energy attenuates very quickly over distance, that if you wanted to read a radio frequency ID tag at 60 feet, you would need to hit it with so much energy that passing birds in between would drop out of the sky, microwaved in a flash. But if there's a radio frequency ID tag reader over at that corner of the room, maybe one that reads you as you enter and leave the room, something that you use to badge in and out, that's exciting the tag, you could have another reader, one that doesn't contain the exciting component, somewhere else with a very focused antenna pointed at that spot that reads the signal as it's emitted. And what this means is that as you carry your Oyster card, as you carry your toll pass and so on, you're not only subject to being read by the authorities and having that abused, but by being read by anyone who wants to invest a few dollars in parts. The dangers of radio frequency ID tag as a tool to track us through time and space are just now beginning to be understood. A few years ago at a Computers, Freedom, and Privacy conference, a few enterprising individuals decided to make Bluetooth readers and to seed them through the conference space. And by the end of the conference, just by reading the beacons that people's Bluetooth lit up as they walked through different rooms, they were able to show us a data simulation that showed us these people know each other. And they are, if you wanted to round up someone and all of his friends, here's how you could find out who his friends were. These people don't go to sessions. These people are smokers. These people go to the bathroom a lot. Maybe they're sick. Maybe they're cokeheads. And so on and so forth. That amount of revelation is now becoming the stuff of easy access for authorities or bad guys. I saw a great presentation of something called the RFID Defender, which was, I think, an ironic name at the Usenix Large Integrated Systems Administration conference last December in DC. These Dutch researchers, undergrads and grad students, had built a device that could selectively read any RFID, emit that RFID signal, and interdict that RFID from emitting its own signal. What this means is that someone can brush up against you with this device that they now have down to the size of a pack of cigarettes, read your RFIDs, interdict your RFIDs so that you can't identify yourself to the door or to the bus or to the turnstile or to the police, and then identify themselves as you with those RFIDs, right? To take those around town and use them. And one of the problems with these supposedly foolproof systems in a state in which you have massive power imbalances between people who need to address the problem, need to address potential failures of them, is that to the extent that these things are believed to be infallible, and they are, it's very hard to convince the authorities that they're wrong. So a great article in Wired a couple of months detailed the fact that insurance companies treat cars that have RFIDs in their key fobs as unstealable. And when your car is stolen, they won't honor your insurance claims because you must be lying if your car with an RFID was stolen, because RFIDs are unstealable. And they went on to document that in one instance, I think it was the Honda Civic, that in fact, because so many people lost their RFID keys, therefore stranding their cars in the middle of freeways or parking lots, that the company had thoughtfully installed a back door that involved a series of pulls and pushes on the emergency brake, which would then start the ignition. That there were a limited number of these combinations, and that they could be had by merely calling up the manufacturer and impersonating a roadside assistance mechanic, and then you could drive away with the car. Closely related to RFIDs are globally unique identifiers. Every RFID has at its soul a globally unique identifier. This is a number that exists theoretically only in one place and is used only by that one thing. So your computer might have a globally unique identifier that it uses to identify itself to a piece of software that locks itself to your motherboard. That's a new feature of Vista, the new Microsoft operating system and the trusted computing platform that's just emerged as part of the Vista strategy, or rather been emerging for a few years as part of the Vista strategy, and Vista is the software component that ties it together. The risk of globally unique identifiers is manifold, but one of them is mission creep. That as soon as there's a number that can be reliably said to uniquely identify some object or service or person, that there will be lots of other people who want to use that globally unique identifier to identify that person. And anyone who's ever been asked for their social security number in order to check into a hotel or rent a car or apply to a university knows that the globally unique identifier creeps and creeps again. That your grocery store might say, yeah, your default password for your grocery store loyalty card should be your social security number, because that's a great secret. One way that we generate globally unique identifiers is with biometrics. Biometrics are things like the unique pattern of your cornea, the unique geometry of your hand, your unique fingerprints, your unique DNA. There are many problems with these globally unique identifiers, with biometrics as a globally unique identifier. One is that for any globally unique identifier you care to name, somewhere around 5% of the population doesn't have it. They're missing a joint off their finger, they have corneal scarring, they were a bricklayer, their hand geometry just doesn't get read by that reader. And what this means is that you force 5% of the population, 1 in 20, down the special something's wrong with you lane whenever you want to transact everyday average business, like getting on a piece of public transit or checking a book out of the library. They have to go through some incredible hassle and to be treated as someone who's suspect or someone who's second class merely because they have some inauspicious collision of their biometric and this one that the society has chosen for them. And most importantly, though, a biometric can't be recalled. So we've had people, for example, fool fingerprint readers using gummy bears. Now, it's possible to fool other kinds of security and access systems using, say, your PIN as read over your shoulder as you enter it into a bank machine. But you can change your PIN. Once your fingerprint is in the wild, you can't ever change it. And that is the biggest risk of a biometric. In addition to the mission creep, that once the biometric is stored in a database, chances are other people are going to want to use it. And of course, biometrics have the additional risk of being the same across the board. A fingerprint's a fingerprint, and we converge on standard ways of storing, accessing, and searching those databases, which means that the fingerprint that you have taken for one purpose could readily be turned into another purpose or merged with other databases to keep your record intact across multiple services and users. The problem with these things is that they condition us to live in a surveillance state. We are conditioning our children to live in a surveillance state, to accept the idea that they should be identified at all times, to accept the idea that they should be searched at all times. It's not just metal detectors at schools. I recently came back from a trip to Walt Disney World over Christmas in Florida, and I discovered that every person who brought a bag to the park was subject to a perfectly cursory, totally meaningless bag search that nevertheless conspired to generate these enormous queues. And that sent, if anything, just the message that we were being watched and not the message that anything in particular was being looked for or indeed found. One day I forgot to take my giant bladed multi-tool out of my bag and walked in and out of like 3 different parks in that day without it being discovered. So much for for safety. After all, we do live in an era in which toothpaste is a potential aviation-killing explosive. Subsequently, you were fingerprinted at the turnstile as a means of keeping you from cheating on your tickets. And the most chilling thing about this was watching kids go up to the bag check already unzipping their knapsack to show all of the pockets to the security guards so that they could move through quickly. And when at one point we said we'd prefer to show ID, which is an option in getting through the turnstile, instead of leaving them with your fingerprint, although it's something that most of the people who work the turnstiles don't know, so every time you do this you have a little psychodrama in which you talk about why you don't want to be fingerprinted and how it is in fact their policy that you can refuse being fingerprinted, and they say it's not a fingerprint, we're merely measuring the unique characteristics of your fingertip. While we were having this argument, and the 10-year-old behind us said, no, you have to be fingerprinted, everyone has to be fingerprinted. We used to worry that Disney was turning our little girls into children who wanted to grow up and be princesses, or that they turned us into perfect consumers. I really worry that Disney is turning our children into people who want to grow up and live in a police state. And then to add to all of these risks that arise from the expansive use of technology to track us, there is a new kind of risk, one that I don't think we'd ever really thought about before and that we don't have any good mental tools for dealing with. And this goes to the heart of why privacy is so hard. It's the privacy violation that happens years after the action. The netheads will remember the day that Deja News went online. This was the search engine that had indexed almost everything that had ever been posted to Usenet, that old conferencing system that I talked about at the start of this talk. Previously, people had treated Usenet as a book written on water. It was perfectly reasonable when you were a freshman to come back from your weekend at Woodstock 99 and talk all about how deep you went into the K-hole, because you knew that that wasn't ever going to show up associated with your name forever to anyone who wants to do a Google search. It subsequently became something that was searchable forever. Now, I celebrate the fact that that data is online because it's a remarkable historical document, but it points out that historically we're pretty bad at measuring the cost of privacy, at understanding what subsequent revelations might do to us and our integrity. And I think the next one of these giant infocalypses, with these next data Valdezes, is going to be when facial recognition software gets just a little better, and someone can say, find me all the photos of Cory Doctorow on the web, even the ones that don't have his name in the file name, even the ones that don't have his name on the web page. And all of us who've relied on the fact that photos aren't searchable by name will suddenly find out that we've been living in a fool's paradise. Information rights management is a mechanism for using technology to count us and account for us and control us and sacrifice our privacy. So digital rights management you're probably familiar with as that stuff that controls how you listen to music or watch videos or read an ebook. Information rights management is a feature in recent versions of Microsoft Office and other tools that allow people who publish documents like PowerPoint slides, Excel spreadsheets, and Word documents to control how those documents are used, whether you can print them, whether you can copy and paste from them, and so on. But every time you locate an information rights management document, every time you look at it, there's a little log of that fact. You generate an audit trail. Suddenly, your anonymous lookup of a PowerPoint sheet could be used as part of a larger pattern of data through which anyone can find anything that they're looking for. You know, as Richelieu said, give me six lines in a man's hand and I will find you a reason to hang him. There will always be something buried in that data that doesn't look good depending on the facts that emerge after the fact. The theory goes, though, that these can be used to correct some of these power imbalances. Bill Gates likes to talk about the example of the hospital, in which the fact that you have HIV is protected by the fact that they can't open that record or pass it on to someone else without your permission, because it's in your information rights management wrapper. And so every time it's opened, they have to query your license server, and you can say yay or nay at each time. Now, Don Marty, the editor of Linux Journal, has pointed out at least one important flaw with this, which is that if you have a receptionist at your hospital who's so dishonest that she's disclosing the fact that you have HIV, but so dumb that she can't remember one bit of information, you have an HR problem, not an IT problem. But I think more importantly is that most of us, when we think about it, recognize that there's no way that we're going to get hospitals to take our information in our DRM wrappers. There's no way we're going to get the IRS to take our tax records in our DRM wrappers. Indeed, if we could trust hospitals with our data, we wouldn't need IRM wrappers to control them, because we would have the whip hand over them. We would know that we were in so much control that the hospitals quaked in fear at the thought of Valdezing our information out onto the internet and would treat it like the precious jewel that it is. Instead, because all privacy revolves around power imbalances, all privacy problems revolve around power imbalances, the transparent society reveals itself as merely another way for those people who have power over us to exercise more power over us. Small surveillance writ large does not equal small surveillance. A curtain twitcher who watches you on the lawn is not the same thing as a network sniffer that watches every packet that you transmit. And there are those who will say, why do you worry about people knowing what web pages you look at? Someone could look over your shoulder and see what web page you're looking at in that cafe. Why shouldn't I be able to wiretap every connection going through that cafe? They're not the same thing. One dirty cop who looks up a record in a database is not the same as widespread NSA surveillance or a school or an employer who looks at everything that you do and keeps a record of it. They're not the same thing. We're sleepwalking into the surveillance state, and kids are at the forefront. We've put closed caption TV cameras all over the world. In London, where I live, you are photographed some 300 times a day as you walk through the streets. These aid sometimes in forensic investigations of problems as they occur, but seem to be wholly useless at preventing those problems. And in the true vein of the totalitarian urge, the answer always seems to be more cameras and better tools to be sure that we're recorded by them. For example, policies against wearing hooded jumpers indoors as a means of ensuring that all those faces are eventually photographed. A friend of my girlfriend's, her fiance, was murdered on his doorstep in London last year, just before we left. And he was murdered by 3 people who were caught on the CCTV as they left the tube to follow him out of the train station. And he's as dead as he's ever going to get. The fact that they subsequently caught those 3 people hasn't changed the fact that he's dead. Indeed, by the time you're following people around and stabbing them on their doorstep for their mobile phone, you're probably the kind of desperate person who is thinking so poorly about your future that you don't look to see whether there's a CCTV. Now, we may be putting these people in jail, but we're not slowing the rate at which they're being created, which is a problem totally distinct from whether or not we're watching. And we're not slowing the rate at which they're intervening with us. That if we want to prevent crime, we need to do so not by creating a nation of curtain-twitching peck sniffs, but rather by addressing the reasons that people engage in crime, which isn't a lack of surveillance. We are seeing tools being rolled out for parents like the Disney phone that will tell you all the places your child has been, and tools to help you prevent predators from attacking your children on MySpace. And these seem to ignore the actual facts on the ground about what endangers our children. If you look at a handy pie chart of sexual predation of children, you'll find that the largest slice of it by far is parents. And then if you take the parents out and make a new pie chart, you'll find that the largest slice of it is friends of parents. And then if you take that remaining slice out and you make a pie chart fractally, you'll find that the largest group are adults whom the parents know and trust, such as teachers and priests and so on. And then when you get to the most infinitesimal slice, the statistically insignificant bump at the very right-hand corner of the curve that nevertheless makes for interesting newscasts, you'll find predators who hunt children on MySpace. And we devote endless efforts to hand-wringing and controlling our children and how they use MySpace and how they self-actualize and how they build good social skills that might in fact enable them to resist the predation of adults in their lives who are actual dangers to them. And we do so in the name of preventing this statistical anomaly over there on the right-hand side of the curve. We're not being made safer. The right to being secure and private is not abrogated by the use of technology. Technology can serve us or enslave us, and ultimately it's our choice how we use it. We can be in a world of universal surveillance Luddites and saboteurs. We can run Tor nodes. Tor is the onion router. It's a tool that was developed by the Office of Naval Intelligence and subsequently released as a piece of free and open source software that's been developed by everyone from Electronic Frontier Foundation to individual hackers all around the world. It was developed to help people who live in surveillance states like China get around web proxies, get around loggers, and find out more about the world than their masters want them to use. This works well for anyone who lives in any surveillance society like a typical American high school or place of work. And you can use Tor to make yourself more private, and that's good because, of course, once everyone is using envelopes, no one questions why you're the only one who's not sending postcards. But you can also do something really special, which is run a Tor node and be one of the nodes through which all that encrypted traffic is bounced through in order to confuse the people who would keep track of us. And I'm proud to say that the server that runs Boing Boing, my blog, the blog I co-edit with 3 other people, is also a Tor node. You can use crypto for the same reason. You can join organizations like Free Culture and the Electronic Frontier Foundation that support your privacy through litigation, through direct action, through lobbying, and so on. And you can become a refusenik. You can refuse to be fingerprinted. You can refuse to agree to the EULA. You can click I disagree. You can jam and you can sabotage and you can make fun and you can be the squeaky wheel. You can be the nail that stands up and maybe doesn't get hammered down this time. All I know is that computers have allowed me to do things that I would never have thought possible, and they've allowed the people around me to do things that I would never have thought possible. And my long-term interest is seeing to it that computers remain a tool of empowerment and not return to that era of I am a student, please do not bend, spindle, fold, or mutilate me, the era in which we marked up those cards that our university administrators gave us that contained our entire identity and were used as a symbol of the machine that controlled our every movement and watched our every movement. I want to stay in the world in which computers are things that empower us and not things that control us. Thank you.